There are names that history carves into monuments of stone and steel, and there are names that the desert forgets. They are whispered by the wind, swallowed by the dunes, and buried under a sun that offers no mercy and no memory. This is the story of one such name, a story etched not in stone, but in the impermanence of sand. The air was a heavy, searing breath, a dry furnace wind that stole the moisture from Seydou's lungs with every inhale. The sun, a brutal and tireless orb, beat down upon the stony, waterless expanse of the Libyan desert, its light a blinding white glare that made the horizon shimmer and twist. Seydou walked with the silent, rhythmic motion of a man who had long since learned to conserve every ounce of energy. His boots, heavy and caked with dust, crushed the scattered gravel beneath a sky that was a merciless, empty blue. The only sounds were the soft crunch of their footfalls, the insistent, maddening buzz of flies, and the low, muttered curses of the men. Seydou Diallo, at 25, was a canvas of the land he had left behind and the war he was forced to endure. His skin, a deep, polished ebony, was now chapped and cracked by the relentless heat and whipping sand. A thin, faint scar sliced through his left eyebrow, a childhood memory of a fall from a mango tree. His head was cleanly shaven, a pragmatic choice for a life defined by sweat and dust. His eyes, however, were the oldest part of him. They held a quiet melancholy, a sadness that was a part of the land of his ancestors, but they held a spark too, the light of a promise. He was right-handed, a simple fact of his existence, but the desert had taught him an ambidexterity of necessity. He could work his rifle or his worn canteen with equal practiced ease, a small detail in a world where every detail mattered. He thought of home. The thought was a constant, a cool breeze in the suffocating heat. He smelled the earth, thick and rich after the rains. He heard the distant, hypnotic beat of the Saber drums from a village celebration. He tasted the impossibly sweet flavor of a mango that Isa had given him once, a flavor he had never found anywhere else. He felt the rough texture of her hand in his, the simple, profound warmth of her touch, a physical memory that kept him going. He carried a small leather amulet around his neck, a tiny, physical link to his faith and his home. It was cool against his skin, a small comfort in the desolate expanse. Beside him, Mamadou Guy, his closest friend and a fellow tirailleur, swore under his breath as a fly landed on his lip. Mamadou was shorter and more heavily built than Seydou, but his shoulders held the same weary weight. He had a quick, cynical wit, a necessary shield against the daily humiliations they faced. "Do you remember what the Boche leaflets said?" Mamadou murmured, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They promised better food, better treatment. They asked why we fight for a country that sees us as nothing but chair à canon." Mamadou's words were laced with bitter irony. Seydou's only response was a slow, deliberate sip from his canteen. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal and the faintest hint of chlorine, nothing like the cool, sweet water from the well in his village. Sergeant Émile Bédard, the French officer in charge of their small patrol, turned his head just enough to catch their conversation. He didn't understand their language, but he understood the tone. "Keep moving, you two. No time to get sentimental. We are not on a holiday." Bedard's voice was a flat, unfeeling monotone. He saw them as big children, a belief that stripped them of their dignity. The ration packets they had received that morning were a subtle confirmation of his contempt. The canned meat was less plentiful than the rations given to the white soldiers. As they continued their patrol, the tension was a living thing. The desert, with its vast, empty stretches, made them feel small and exposed. Every shadow could be an enemy, every distant dust cloud a patrol. Seydou's mind was a battlefield of its own, caught between the promise of a peaceful life with Isa and the stark reality of his current existence. His greatest fear was not dying, but being forgotten, his sacrifice made invisible by a country that had already decided his life was worth less. Then, at sunset, something shifted. A single, distinct pinprick of light appeared on the horizon, far to the west. It winked out, then reappeared. "What is that?" Mamadou asked, his voice now devoid of its usual irony. Bedard dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Just a flare, bridge patrol most likely." But the light pulsed again, a different color this time. A low rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the very ground itself, traveled through the soles of their boots. The sound was not the wind, it was the low growl of an engine, followed by another and another. It was a sound Seydou knew all too well from months of fighting. "Tanks," Seydou said, his voice flat. Captain Dubois, who had been walking a few yards ahead, stopped and raised his binoculars. He looked for a long moment, the tension in his shoulders growing with each second. The sounds grew louder, a mechanical hum that cut through the silence of the desert. "It's a German patrol," Dubois said, his voice low and urgent, "and they are moving fast." The command was given, "Take cover, prepare to engage." The men scattered, their practiced movements the only thing holding the sudden fear at bay. The boredom and tedium of the patrol vanished in an instant, replaced by the sharp metallic taste of adrenaline on Seydou's tongue. The hunt was on, and they were now the hunted. The sun, an orange scar on the horizon, had bled its last light across the vast emptiness. With its departure came the sudden, violent cold of the desert night. It was a cold that gnawed at the skin, a stark and merciless contrast to the scorching heat of the day. The patrol had found refuge on a small, rocky escarpment, a jagged rise of stone that offered a modicum of cover from the wind that swept the sand in low, mournful whispers. The air, no longer a furnace, was now a silent, biting presence, and the men huddled together, their warmth a shared, fragile thing. The only light was a weak, flickering glow from a shielded lantern, its pale beam struggling to hold back the encroaching blackness. Seydou sat with his back to a smooth, cool rock, the cold seeping through his uniform. He was no longer just a body in the desert. He was a mind adrift in a sea of memory and anticipation. The constant physical discomfort of the day gave way to the deep psychological ache of the night. He thought of his home, of Isa, and of the things he had left behind, the memories more vivid and real than the hard ground beneath him. He could almost hear the sound of the Sabar drums, their insistent rhythm, a heartbeat of joy and community that was so utterly absent here. The thought was a soft ache in his chest, a longing for a life that felt 1,000 miles away and 1,000 years ago. Mamadou, his eyes fixed on the empty darkness, shivered and pulled his blanket tighter. "The Boche leaflets," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They promised us food, a warm bed. They said we were just cannon fodder for a country that didn't care about us." There was no anger in his voice, only a profound, weary cynicism. "Maybe they weren't entirely wrong, eh? We're a different color, so we get a different kind of war." Seydou remained silent for a moment, tracing the patterns on the leather amulet around his neck. The cool smoothness of the leather brought him back to the present. He thought of the small bag of peanuts Isa had sent him, a simple gesture of love that now felt like a relic from another world. He confessed to Mamadou, his voice barely audible above the wind, that he was more afraid of being forgotten than of dying. To be a hero, but to have no one know your name, to have your life mean nothing. Mamadou turned his head to look at him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "They told me once, the French officers," he said, and his tone hardened, "that we are children, that we need them to show us the way, to civilize us." He scoffed, a short, bitter sound. "So you see, they've already forgotten us. They've decided we were never men to begin with. We were just boys they dressed up in a uniform." Sergeant Émile Bedard, who had been listening from a few feet away, leaned forward, his face barely visible in the dark. He spoke in French, a language that Seydou and Mamadou understood but did not speak in moments of intimacy. He called their conversation sentimental, a sign of weakness that they should shed. His condescending tone was not violent, but it was a constant reminder of the invisible barrier that separated them. The exchange was cut short by Captain Armand Dubois. He was a silent, brooding man, and he seemed to inhabit a world of his own weary exhaustion. But now his voice was sharp with urgency. "Quiet, all of you." The tension in the air, a subtle hum just moments before, became a sharp, electric thing. All eyes turned to the west, to the horizon where the last vestiges of light were long gone. A faint, distant sound began to reach them, a sound that Seydou knew and dreaded. It was the low, guttural growl of an engine, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was followed by another and another until the collective rumble was a low, insistent vibration that traveled through the rock and into their bones. "Could it be?" one of the men asked, his voice cracking with a hope he didn't truly believe in. Dubois shook his head. "No." His voice was a flat, grim finality. "No Allied patrols here. And look, on the edge of the horizon, a single light, a pinprick of orange, appeared and then vanished. It was a brief, almost imperceptible signal, but for the men who had spent weeks in this desolate landscape, it was an unmistakable sign. The silence was over. The game had begun. The adrenaline coursed through Seydou's veins, sharp and cold. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The fear of being forgotten was still there, but now a new feeling took over, the sharp, clear focus of a man preparing to fight for his life. The predator had announced itself. They only had to wait for it to arrive. The low rumble became a guttural roar, a sound that rose from the horizon like a storm and enveloped them. The first German tank, a hulking, dark shape, crested a small dune, its silhouette monstrous against the moonlit sand. A second and a third followed, their tracks churning the earth, the very ground trembling under the weight of their advance. The night, so cold and quiet just moments before, was now alive with the metallic clank of tank treads and the sudden, sharp crack of rifle fire. The order to engage came from Captain Dubois, his voice clear and sharp with the finality of a decision already made. The men, their earlier tensions now replaced by a cold, immediate focus, took their positions. Seydou pressed the cold metal of his rifle against his cheek. He had never been in a true tank assault before. The patrols had been tense, but this was different. The sheer force of the enemy's approach was a physical presence, a weight on the air that felt impossible to push back. The first shell exploded with a thunderclap of sound and light, a hot, blinding flash that threw their shadows against the rocks for a split second before plunging them back into a darkness filled with dust and the acrid tang of cordite. Seydou fired, his rifle kicking back against his shoulder. The heat of the barrel warmed his hands, a small, tangible anchor in the chaos. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled his nostrils, mixing with the sharp, metallic scent of gasoline from the engines. The grit of sand,
kicked up by the explosions, and the wind stung his eyes and coated his mouth. He saw the flash of Mamadou's rifle from a few yards away. They were both firing methodically, their movements as practiced as a dance, but the rhythm was of desperate survival. A new sound joined the chorus, the distinct, higher-pitched rat-tat-tat of a machine gun. A burst of bullets chipped the rock just above Seydou's head, the sharp ping of ricochets a terrifying reminder of how exposed they were. The small patrol was a flimsy shield against an overwhelming mechanized force. He saw Sergeant Bedard, the old, racist officer, standing to get a better vantage point. His mouth was open, shouting an order that was lost to the wind and the din of battle. A burst of machine gun fire from one of the approaching tanks caught him mid-sentence. The sound was a quick, flat pop, and Bedard's body jerked violently before crumpling to the ground without a sound. There was no heroics in his death, no final word, just the brutal, random indifference of war. Seydou felt a flicker of something in his gut, not sadness, but a dark, hollow confirmation that in this hell, prejudice and privilege meant nothing. The desert would claim them all without distinction. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes. Then, a new sound, or rather, the sudden absence of one, made Seydou's heart pound harder than any explosion. The thrumming roar of the French guns, which had been providing covering fire from a ridge miles behind them, fell silent. The shock of the silence was more profound than any noise. The world seemed to hold its breath. Through the chaos, Seydou saw Captain Dubois, his face a grim mask of exhaustion and resignation, raise his binoculars to his eyes and then lower them. He shouted something to the men, his voice strained and thin against the enemy's deafening advance. "Withdrawal! The order is to withdraw!" The men, disoriented and desperate, began to retreat towards the east. Seydou and Mamadou were not among them. Dubois' voice, now a grim whisper, reached them over the din. "Cover the rear! Hold them back!" The words, though expected, were a physical blow. The unspoken part hung in the air, a truth as cruel and stark as the desert landscape. "We are leaving you behind." Seydou's hands, which had been steady as he fired, now trembled with a cold rage that had nothing to do with the desert night. The betrayal was not a sudden act, but the brutal culmination of every slight, every condescending word, every unequal ration. They weren't just soldiers, they were cannon fodder, just as the German leaflets had called them. They were black lives considered less valuable than the white lives they were protecting. It was not an order, but a sacrifice, a cold, calculated abandonment. The noise of the battle was once again a deafening symphony of destruction, but for Seydou, it was all a distant backdrop. He watched the silhouettes of his French comrades disappear over the horizon. He was alone with Mamadou and the few other tirailleurs that were left. The ground beneath their feet was no longer just sand and rock, it was a grave, and they had just been left to dig it for themselves.
The silence that followed was not the peaceful stillness of the desert night. It was a heavy, living silence, thick with the absence of the French guns and the echo of the German engines. The roar of the battle had vanished, replaced by the wind and the soft, desperate sound of their own ragged breathing. The air still carried the sharp, metallic tang of cordite and the coppery smell of blood. It clung to Seydou's uniform and coated his tongue, a constant, sickening reminder of what had just happened and what they were about to face. Seydou moved, his body aching with exhaustion and the cold fury of betrayal. Mamadou was a few feet away, lying on his side against a rock. A thin, dark stain was spreading on his uniform, a sickening bloom of red and black in the dim moonlight. The pain in Seydou's own leg, a searing, hot ache where a bullet had grazed his calf, was a dull complaint compared to the agony in his heart. He crawled to Mamadou, his fingers scrabbling on the gritty sand. He saw the grim truth in his friend's eyes before he even spoke. Mamadou's face, which had always held a trace of a cynical smile, was now a mask of agony and resignation. He tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped his lips, a sound of profound finality. He coughed, and blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. They are gone," Mamadou rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The bastards. They left us." Seydou's hand found Mamadou's, and he squeezed it tight. The bitterness in his friend's voice was a validation of all the unspoken truths they had shared. Mamadou was dying not for a cause he believed in, but as a footnote to a betrayal. He was dying because a life of a black soldier was deemed less valuable than that of a white one. The German propaganda, with its promise of decent treatment for black soldiers, seemed almost ironic now, a lie that contained a horrifying grain of truth. Mamadou's eyes, wide with a terrible clarity, were fixed on Seydou. He struggled for a final breath, a last confession. They don't care about our names, Seydou. They only care about the sand we bleed on." The words were a fragile thread, and then they were gone. His hand went limp in Seydou's, his body went still. Seydou laid his head against Mamadou's chest and listened to the slow, fading drumbeat of his friend's heart. The rhythm, so like the Sabar drums he longed for, was now a hollow echo, a final goodbye. He closed his eyes, his face a grimace of grief, and silently promised his friend that he would not be forgotten. The tears that finally came were hot on his dust-caked cheeks, a fleeting comfort that was quickly consumed by the dry, unforgiving air. Alone now, Seydou felt a new and terrible weight. It was not the weight of his rifle, or the ache in his leg. It was the weight of the dead, a burden of memory he now carried for both of them. He carefully unbuttoned Mamadou's jacket and removed a small, simple wooden amulet from his neck, placing it alongside his own. The two talismans, one of wood and one of leather, were now bound together, a silent testimony to a friendship forged in the crucible of war and broken by an act of cold, calculated cruelty. The remaining members of the patrol were either dead or scattered, their bodies lost to the vast indifference of the desert. Seydou was a lone figure now, a speck of dust in an empty sea. The moon cast long, ghoulish shadows over the battlefield, and the remnants of the fight looked like a broken graveyard. A half-buried helmet, the jagged metal of a wrecked jeep, and the footprints of men who were now gone. Thirst, a physical manifestation of his solitude, began to claw at his throat. He had to move. There was no food, no water, no relief from the biting cold or the crushing loneliness. The landscape, once a stage for battle, was now a silent, implacable enemy, promising to consume him as it had consumed so many others. As he began to walk, putting one foot in front of the other, a distant sound reached him over the wind, a sound he had learned to dread. It was the faint, unmistakable rumble of a motorized patrol. It was not the French. It was not the British. It was Rommel's men, the Africa Corps sweeping the battlefield for stragglers. The hunt was not over. The game had not ended. Seydou tightened his grip on his rifle, the metal cold and hard in his hand. He was no longer running for a nation that had betrayed him or for a love he might never see again. He was running for the memory of a friend, for a silent promise made under a black, indifferent sky. He was running so that Mamadou's name would not be forgotten,
so that the sand would not bury the truth of their sacrifice. He was running so that the last of them, the final witness, would survive. He was running on pure adrenaline and the cold, burning fire of rage. He was ready for the end.
The sun was a searing disk, its light a malevolent glare against the pale expanse of the desert sky. Seydou moved like a phantom, his body a silent protest against the sun, the wind, and the ache that had settled deep in his bones. The heat of the day returned with a vengeance, but it was a different kind of heat now, a feverish, burning sensation that had nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with the blood in his veins and the rage in his heart. The scent of burnt cordite was long gone, replaced by the dry, sterile smell of dust and the faint, sweet scent of metal. The weight of his rifle, once a familiar comfort, was now a heavy, leaden thing. The ammunition he carried felt heavier still, each round a promise of a future he might not live to see. He was alone, utterly and completely. He had buried Mamadou in a shallow grave, using his bayonet to dig at the rocky ground. It was an impossible task, a desperate act of honor for a friend whose life had been taken by an enemy and a country that had abandoned him. He had placed the amulets, his, Mamadou's, and the one he had taken from another fallen comrade, on the small makeshift mound. The sight of the 3 small leather and wood talismans, silent witnesses to a silent war, was a final heart-wrenching image. Thirst had become a physical presence, a clawing at the back of his throat. His lips were cracked and dry, and the taste of his own blood, from a small wound on his lip, was a sharp, metallic reminder of his fragile existence. The last of his water had been given to Mamadou, a final, futile gesture of care. He knew his body was protesting, screaming for a rest it could not have. He was a single point of life in a sea of death, a memory of a man walking in a land of ghosts. He had been walking for what felt like an eternity, but it had only been hours. His senses were on high alert, sharpened by the primal need for survival. Every shadow, every rock seemed to hold a threat. The low, distant rumble returned, not as a storm, but as a subtle, grinding approach. He saw them then. A small German patrol, their uniforms a dark stain against the pale sand, their vehicles kicking up a low, golden cloud of dust. There were only 2 of them, a reconnaissance mission, probably looking for survivors. The sight of them was not a surprise, but a grim confirmation of his fate. He knew what he had to do. He would not surrender. He would not give them the satisfaction of a captured body. He would make them remember. He found a small cluster of rocks, barely enough to provide cover, and settled in. The wind, which had been his only companion, now seemed to whisper warnings in his ear. The sun, once his enemy, now seemed to conspire with him, its blinding glare a shield against the eyes of the approaching enemy. His mind went back to Isa, to the warmth of her hand, to the sweetness of the mangoes they used to share. He saw her face not with the sharp, clear lines of a memory, but with the soft focus of a dream. He was not fighting for France anymore. He was not fighting for a concept of a homeland he had never truly known. He was fighting for her, for the memory of their love, for the promise of a life that had been so cruelly taken from him. He was a hero who would have no monument. His name would not be in the records. His life would be forgotten by the nation he fought for. But his final act would be his own. It would be a testament to his life, to his people, to the love that had sustained him through this long, brutal journey. He raised his rifle, the cold metal a part of his own hand, and took aim. The first shot was a clean, sharp crack in the silence, followed by another. The Germans were surprised, disoriented. They returned fire, the bullets buzzing around him like angry bees.
He was hit, a searing pain in his side, but he kept firing. He felt another blow, this one to his chest. He took a final breath, the air filling his lungs with the dust of the desert, and he smiled. It was a smile of peace, a smile of defiance. He didn't see the last man fall. He was already somewhere else, walking not on the hot, unforgiving sand, but on the cool, damp earth of his homeland. He saw Isa, her face a beacon of light, and he felt her arms around him, her embrace the home he had always longed for. The sun had set on his life, but his memory would live on, carried by the wind and the whispering sands, a testament to the life of a forgotten hero. His story was a story for the earth, a story for the stars, a story for all the heroes whose names the desert chose to remember.